and welcome to Reflections on Reproductive Justice with Faye Wattleton. My name is Dr. Brenda Aiken, Barnard class of 1977, and a 1981 graduate of the College of Physicians and Surgeons. I am here today as a member of the Black Alumni Council representing Columbia Health, as the Associate Vice President of Medical Services, and as a member of the Alumni Leadership Group Planning Committee, which she opened the door programs over the last several years. For those of you who don't know, the She Opened the Door name refers to Winifred Edgerton Merrill, the first woman to earn a Columbia degree, and is an initiative that aims to enlighten, educate, elevate, and to empower all self-identifying women across the university. We are thrilled that you have decided to join us this evening for this imperative conversation about the history, current status, and future of reproductive justice in America. We are especially honored to have Faye Wattleton, Columbia School of Nursing, class of 1967, here to share her insights with us, and are deeply grateful to Dr. Vivian Taylor, Associate Dean of Diversity and Cultural Affairs at the Columbia School of Nursing, for joining us in this conversation this evening. I'd like to share a few words about Dr. Vivian Taylor and also Faye Wattleton. Since 2013, Vivian A. Taylor has served as Associate Dean of Diversity and Cultural Affairs at the Columbia University School of Nursing. And prior to that, served for several years, over 28 years, in multiple roles at Barnard College. In her role at Columbia Nursing School, she has worked closely with the school in promoting a climate of belonging and inclusion and implementing the school's commitment to anti-racism, social justice, health equity. In the wider community, Dr. Taylor has facilitated Columbia Nursing's involvement in the community outreach initiatives, including health literacy programs, health screening, the promotion of health careers, overseeing nursing pipeline programs, and the development of a diverse workforce. She supports the school, the nursing school, and the university's LGBTQ+ health initiatives and outreach. Vivian holds 2 degrees from the University of Pittsburgh, a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Education, and a Doctor of Education from Teachers College of the university. She is a justice advocate. Throughout her career, she has been committed to creating and sustaining diversity initiatives and has shown leadership and vision in developing and implementing programs that bring equity, access, and support to the disenfranchised, the underrepresented, and the marginalized members of our society. She is dedicated to educational principles and efforts that strengthen communities, dismantle oppressive system structures, and build partnerships that advance justice. Thank you so much, Vivian, for being with us tonight. Now to our honored speaker. Faye Wattleton became president of Planned Parenthood in 1978, a position that she held until 1992. As the first woman to serve as the organization's president since its founder, Margaret Sanger, Faye was the first Black American and the youngest president in the organization's history. Faye is credited with developing the organization's extensive national grassroots advocacy network that became a powerful lobby force to block efforts to restrict and overturn women's rights to make reproductive choices. Additionally, her powerful and articulate leadership gave the organization's visibility that furthered its mission and extended its reach. During her administration, she directed the expansion of reproductive health care services for women and families from over 1.1 million to about 5 million in 1990. Her strong leadership has made a powerful difference in the lives of many American women and their families. I am honored to join her here today to talk about her insight on the history, current status, and future of reproductive justice in America. Thank you. Now, please welcome me to the stage, Dr. Vivian Taylor and Faye Wattleton. Thank you.
daughter, but just an advocate for women's reproductive rights. And I want you to be able to talk to us a little bit about what has been the guiding force in your life. How has your activism impacted by your personal life, your education, and then your time as a nurse?
Wow. I didn't get a chance to see these questions ahead of time. So I suppose we can start from the beginning. That I was born into a family of Southern Black Americans that had a vision of a better life out of the South. My mother was from Mississippi, my father was from Alabama, and they met in St. Louis where I was born. My mother felt the call to the ministry when she was 17 because she had decided on her father's farm that she would not pick cotton anymore. And he was not a sharecropper, he was a landowner. But she had won a 7-state competition, that a 4-H competition, that afforded her a trip to Washington, D.C., and she saw the big city and the bright lights, and she decided she was not going to pick cotton anymore. And so preaching was a better job than picking cotton. And when she got back to Mississippi, she said to her mother and father, she claims, that you can beat me every day. I know that you're saved and you believe in God and you're not going to kill me, but I'm not going to pick cotton anymore. She was the eldest daughter and very strong-willed. And I tell that story because it really was reflective of how her life evolved, that impacted and influenced my development and how I saw the world. But she was born in 1915, so we're really talking about being pretty audacious and also to a Southern family. But it's not unusual that for the oldest daughter of a rural family to carry a tremendous burden in the home at that time.
She was the oldest of how many?
She was the oldest daughter, but there were 9 in all. But the 7-state 4-H competition that she won, and she said that a carload of white people came to their farm to be sure that she really existed, afforded her a trip to Washington, D.C., where she gave her essay from her competition on national NBC radio. And so she had already seen show business. And so when she got back to Mississippi, she said she was not going to participate in the family's enterprise. And so they sent her north to live with a family of church people, and these were denominations. The denomination was Church of God. And it was within that sphere of the whole world opening to her. And I tell this story because out of that, I was raised in a very strict, cloistered, narrow environment, but yet her life had opened so dramatically from the farms of Farm Haven, Mississippi, when she saw a bigger world in Washington, D.C., and yet her ministry and her life and the influence on my life was so enormously narrow. It's really a great paradox as to how that came. I must say that at the beginning of all of this, I am the great-granddaughter of a slave on that Mississippi plantation was born her grandmother, my great-grandmother, and I knew her. So when we talk about the arc of development in this country, to think that I'm sitting before you as a slave great-grandmother, not somebody that was told to me, but Aunt Mariah was born in 62 and died in 57. I think you can tell I was not born after 1957. And so her early life was certainly probably influenced by Reconstruction and the need for education and civic engagement, which my great-grandmother was said to have involved herself quite a bit in Mississippi. So, I mean, it goes, the lineage of family influence can really define who you turn out to be because of all that gets passed on and the value system that gets passed on.
So how did the nursing piece get, I mean, were there any examples?
So when I was born, and my mother was at that point, felt the call to the ministry, church was at the center of our lives, which is certainly that's not exotic within the African American family. Church is the center, and that was the social structure of our family, going to church on Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, if there was some special program for the visiting preachers, Sunday evening, Wednesday night.
Wednesday night Bible study?
Bible studies on Wednesday night, prayer meeting it was called, on Wednesday night. So it was raised intensely under an intensely religious environment, and the church, out of the culture of African American lives, is the center, was then the center of our social engagement. And it happened that my upbringing was in a denomination that was especially rigid and conservative. And so that's kind of the arc. And I mean, when people say this is a horrible country and it's not worth voting for, it's worth voting for because, in my lifetime, I knew someone who was born a slave on a Mississippi plantation, and my daughter graduated from Harvard with an undergraduate degree and magna cum laude. So in the course of that time, historically, if there are historians in the room, I'm sure there must be, you understand that this is not even a blink of an eye in terms of the kind of progress that has been made in this country.
But the nursing piece.
The nursing piece, well, nothing could be done, you were to do nothing that did not have a religious purpose. And that's why I wanted to give you the background of my upbringing and the rigid fealty and observance of my family's engagement with religion.
Right.
And so on Sunday nights, some of the Sunday night services, came the missionaries from Kenya. And they would tell the stories of Kenya, how they were serving in mission hospitals, and the stories that they would lay out. Mainly, they were white missionaries in a black church. Were fascinating and captivating. And so I decided, and they were often from the mission hospitals, because that was often the way that the colonizers engaged in underdeveloped countries. And so I was captivated by this, and so I decided I wanted to be a nurse. I can't remember when I did not want to be a nurse. It's ironic that I didn't really become the nurse that my mother had hoped for me to become, which was a missionary nurse, that I would serve in mission hospitals around the world. And that was kind of, it was the indoctrination and the nexus of religion with service. It wasn't just to be. Our church was in the neighborhood of Homer G. Phillips, one of the most famous hospitals serving African Americans in the world. And yet, her fantasy for me was to go to Africa and to serve in mission hospitals, to uplift. So the uplifted message was very, very, very strong in my background. Even though we needed plenty of uplifting ourselves, it was still that there was still somebody else that needed to be lifted up. To a better place than they might be, and we were better off than they are. So that was really where it came in. Again, the irony is that my work eventually came to be an opposition to religious dogma of the sort that I was raised on. And it gave me both perspective of service and commitment and standing up for what you believed in. And keep in mind, my mother was a woman minister in the 40s and 50s, when that was not something that was well regarded and well received. And when I was about 6, she decided that she wanted to be a full-time minister. And the denomination asked her to go to the South because she was from the South and serve congregations in the South. And so my father decided to support her, and that set upon a life of traveling, tent revivals. After the third grade of my, after my third grade, I was not in one school 2 years in a row until high school. So we traveled a lot. It was a great, it was a life of uncertainty in many respects. I say that I was born and socialized in a very, very ethnic black family and community, and then there was the road that we were on and the Jim Crow years. But my mother was asked to serve in a congregation in Columbus, Nebraska that was all white, and the town was all white, and we were the only colored people there. So I learned to live in a totally different social environment, which has, all of this I tell you is a tapestry that has served me well in the work that I was eventually asked to do and privileged to serve.
Wow, that's amazing. And it also goes to show about the sort of really independent stance that you saw a woman have.
Yes.
And that you could then emulate and take on. I mean, I
Well,
could just
all the
see
women,
that.
all the women in my mother's family, and to some degree, although my father was alienated from his, well, he was actually ostracized by his family because he married a woman preacher.
Wow.
And they considered that just so unacceptable, to the point that when he, a lot of this I'm not, well, it's in my book, but some of it I guess I have not talked about. He was so aligned with my mother that he is buried next to my mother's father. He did not want to be buried back in Alabama, and made me promise him on his deathbed that I would allow him to be buried in Mississippi. So yes, it was. If you think that what you do in life doesn't have an effect on others who see you and watch you, and take from you the bits and pieces of you that are relevant to them, then you're really missing a lot about what really makes us human.
Absolutely.
And so I was a child of a mother who stood up. She preached in the South. My father, she preached against segregation in Louisiana and Mississippi, tent revivals. Do you guys know about tent revivals?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The yellow light, so that the bugs don't get you. I was often, I would always be left with church families to go to school, but in the summer I was on the road with my parents.
Wow.
So I had a lot of lectures called sermons that I listened to. That served me well as in my professional life because of the ability to articulate and to persuade. And I was always going to the altar to ask for forgiveness for something. I never knew what it was to get saved.
Wow.
From my mother's preaching.
Wow. I love it. Well, women's reproductive rights have a long history in our country, of course. Can you take us back to the time, your time at Planned Parenthood, Roe versus Wade, and standing on the steps of the Supreme Court?
Well, I can take you back, but I can't really tell you how I felt without telling you what the Columbia experience meant that got me there. That has informed all of the time that I've stood and been in the chambers of the Supreme Court and thought about my experience both in training at Ohio State. I did my undergraduate degree at Ohio State and my master's here in maternal and infant health and midwifery here at Columbia. Ironically, I came to Columbia because my OBGYN professor at Ohio State told me that I should pursue, if I wanted to pursue a master's, that I should pursue one that was attached to a midwifery program. And there weren't many in those years, and so I decided to pursue the 3 that were around, and that was Frontier Nursing Service at Berea College in Harlan, Kentucky. I would have been on horseback delivering babies in the hollers of Kentucky. That didn't appeal to me a lot. And then there was Maternity Center in New Mexico under a Catholic university. Now the irony of looking at Catholic university is that my mother preached and inveighed against Catholicism, the irony of my work, because she perceived Catholicism as being a political order, not a religious one. And so then I looked at Columbia, and the clinical opportunity here would be at Harlem Hospital. And so the reason I say that I can't tell you how I felt about those experiences at the Supreme Court, because it was informed by those experiences at Columbus, at Ohio State, caring for pregnant women, pregnant teenagers. My college roommate and I would work on the weekends at Children's Hospital, caring for abused and injured children that were most likely the victims of parental abuse, unwanted, and the many complexities of that. And then coming to Columbia, most of our didactic work at that time was in the School of Public Health, and the clinical work I was assigned to Harlem Hospital, at the Women's Hospital, the Women's Pavilion it was called. And this was in the late 60s, and there was no reformed abortion in New York. There was no reformed abortion anywhere. It was just after contraception had been legalized in Connecticut, in Griswold versus Connecticut. This was a time of great turbulence in this country. The late 60s were about the women's movement, the war, the peace movement, the civil rights movement. There was enormous turbulence at that time, and not the least of which was the turbulence that imposed and impinged on women. So I, whether it was on the Supreme Court, or whether it was giving a speech, or whether it was having to be ushered in through a back door at a venue, or whether it was talking to the FBI about credible threats on my life, or whether it was just doing what I'm doing now, talking about the work that I have been privileged to do, it has always been with me that where I came from as the granddaughter of Southern Black people who came up from a state that is and remains the poorest in the country, without privilege and without benefit, and the opportunities to be educated in the North, and to have the irony is to select a profession. I promise you I wouldn't be sitting here if I decided I wanted to be a teacher, because I would not have had that exposure. And so I was never willing to compromise, because I remember the women that came in injured and battered when I was teaching nursing right after college at Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton. And we mixed them with the normal obstetrics patients. And then there were whispers, and then there were the doctors that were delivering babies one day, and yet we knew that they were doing illegal abortions other days. And then there was Columbia, and the Women's Pavilion at Harlem Hospital was really I would say a laboratory. That sounds kind of crass, but it really was an opportunity to interact with women that were really poor. I did my senior thesis on, this is really crazy, because we were seeing a lot of babies born with narcotic addiction, birth syndrome. And so I thought, well, we're not picking this up in the prenatal clinic very well. What can we do? And of course, my proposal today would have ethical challenges. But my thesis was on identifying heroin use in prenatal women. And I don't use the word mother because a pregnant woman is not a mother, she's a woman. Through electrical phoresis from urine samples. Now, that probably would not meet any ethical standards today without passing the review boards. But that was my view even then. And I was like in my early 20s when I was in graduate school. It just seemed to me that here were these babies being born to heroin-addicted women, mothers when they were delivered, and all of the what problems and what hope do they have if we can't somehow intervene meddling, basically, not with the mother knowing that we were doing these tests, but identifying substance abuse or substance use in pregnancy, which now would be cause for her to possibly be arrested and charged with manslaughter. In some states, there have been cases along that line, and the Supreme Court has looked favorably on those cases.
Wow. Well, another area of women's health where we see a lot of disparity is in maternal mortality and how it is disproportionately affecting Black women. And so I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, maternal mortality is a complex issue that is very often subjected to very simplistic ideas or comments or commentary. And this is my opinion. When we intervene with respect to maternal outcomes at pregnancy, it's way too late. And so we talk about the intersectionality of social justice with reproductive health. And what can we expect that the outcome is going to be if the general status of health does not meet the equitable standards of health care and of what we know? What can we expect if the access to health care, and we certainly have seen that in the pandemic, the access to health care is greatly disparate in our country still. What outcome can we expect when there are not enough healthcare providers to offer that service to a woman that is most likely to be compromised? Now, this is not to say that this is true in every circumstance, but maternal mortality is not so subject to the simplistic remedies that are very often offered. There really does seem to be a shortage of healthcare workers or professionals in the area of women's health, period.
Yeah.
There's so much about women's health that is improved. There's a lot more attention to recognizing that we're not miniature men, and that that the research needs to be conducted in a manner that is relevant to our composition and gender composition. And the fluidity of that today, it raises a number of questions and a number of challenges. But I think it is not. We lag behind other developed countries, other advanced countries with respect to maternal mortality. But we are certainly better than the developing world, which we obviously should be. But the answers to our maternal mortality really do start well before pregnancy, well before adulthood. And unless we reckon with inequities in health and access to health care, we're not going to change that picture, because it's not that easy to prop up a woman who may have, for all of her life, not had the best opportunities to health care, to education, and to all that results in her white counterparts having better outcomes. Now, there are those of you, I'm sure, that are already saying there are the genetic links, of course. Well, yeah, there are genetic links. There will be women who will die in pregnancy because pregnancy is not an inconsequential condition, by the way. It happened. I wanted to make this point. I'm trying this out on you guys for the first time tonight, but I made a list. I guess it's over there in my bag. I made a list of all of the systems that are adversely affected in a woman's body during pregnancy, whether it's muscular skeletal, whether it's cardiovascular, blood volume is significantly advanced, whether it's the whole endocrine system goes into overdrive. You know, the pregnancy is a dangerous condition, okay? Nobody should be forced to have one against their will, to subject the changes that go on in one's body without well-informed and having the means and the measures to have a positive outcome. So, I mean, yeah, we can throw up the flag that, you know, let's have, you know, it's terrible that African American women, our maternal mortality is 4 times white women's. That is terrible, but it is also terrible that anyone would force a woman to subject her body to this condition of pregnancy against her will, let alone a woman who does not have access to the resources and has not had access to the resources that are bountiful among her white sisterhood. So I'm probably a voice in the wilderness on that one, but again, I think that these things, we should resist the temptation to oversimplify what is often a complex human situation. And oversimplification gets us off the hook because, you know, we can just say, well, we just have more prenatal clinics. And I say, well, that's a little late. And if we had just more equitable health care, and if we recognized that there are economic and social and education disparities, and that we, you know, this gets around to the justice part of the conversation that you wanted to have.
Well, now you turn our attention to June 24th.
Okay.
And your where you're at and your reaction to the Dobbs ruling, and were you surprised?
No, of course not. I don't know why anybody was surprised, frankly, because the court has been overturning Roe v. Wade for 40 years. Why were we surprised? Was anybody surprised? The court took a whack at poor women in 1980 when it upheld the Hyde Amendment.
Well, we took for granted that we've had
Why would we take it for granted when poor women were the first targets of attack?
Yeah.
Why would we take for granted when the Catholic Church in the late 60s made the declaration that we are going to make this a top priority for our denomination, and we're going to go political to do that. And out of that came the National Right to Life Committee. The only reason that we are here today where we are is because we just simply stopped paying attention and engaged in fantasy. Yeah, I mean, the court started with the Hyde Amendment upholding, saying that Congress can decide how it wants to use its money as it sees fit, even if it creates disparities. And that was in the dueling decision. And there have been all along chips on Roe v. Wade. We did not have Roe v. Wade on the 23rd of June. We had a piece of Roe v. Wade. In 2007, the court upheld in Gonzales that states did not have to consider a woman's health in prohibiting abortion, and we yawned at that. That was a major building pillar of Roe v. Wade, that the state could in fact regulate the provision of abortion and the conditions in which it could be performed. But never if a woman's life, that effectively Roe said that these are very complex issues and we don't have the wisdom as a body to decide them. It should be left to the woman, her physician, to the people who guide her value system, to her family, and to her circumstances. We do not have that level of wisdom. It's beautiful language written by a Republican justice. And so, you know, why did we then allow them to say, well, you know, politicians really can decide when a woman should have access to this aspect of her body, not somebody else's body, but her body. And that has been rolling along very predictably, not predictably, but very sadly. And I want to be sure to get the correct year of Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania in '92. We marched. That was the first million. The Capitol Police said, oh, there were only 300,000. We said, oh, no, there were 1 million of us marching. Because, you know, that's always the way it is in Washington. When you march, the marchers always think, Mr. Trump tried to do that. His inauguration, right? The marchers always think that we're many times over. But the undue burden philosophy came about with this particular decision, saying that the states could regulate it and they could put restrictions and requirements as long as it wasn't undue. Well, what is undue if you have to if at that point 83% of the counties of the country had no provision of abortion services. Yeah. And you know what? It's not just about abortion. And this is not in the script, but this issue is really about controlling women and our status in society. So when there's the great temptation to say, well, they don't care about kids after they are born. Well, no, they don't, because that's not what this issue is about. It really is about how do we really control the choices that women have, and how do we hold them in position of traditional roles of being caregivers, infant bearers, childbearing. I said that a bit inelegantly. And in tradition. And you can only read Mr. Alito's opinion to recognize that he has a romance with the 1700s. And taking us back. I mean, the tone of it should outrage us all, that we should all decide that we are going to do what we did with Bork, which was defeat anybody that comes along to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not give us that opportunity. That was a great misfortune, a great unfortune. Had she stepped down when she realized that she had a fatal disease, we probably would not be here, quite here today. But the battle rages on. So as you can tell, I'm not for sainthood for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but because of what it meant in terms of the court's projections. No, I was not surprised, because it's been coming. Undue burden. In Gonzales, it effectively said a woman's health doesn't have to be considered in prohibiting abortion. Why weren't we in the streets on that? Why weren't we at the why weren't we at the Senate hearing saying we're not going to have this, we're not going to have Kavanaugh because we don't believe that he's telling the truth. We defeated Robert Bork in 1987. We defeated, and see, let me just give a little civics lesson. There is one opportunity that the people have to decide our fate and who arbitrates our rules, and that is at the time of the confirmation. Unfortunately, most people take a hands-off stance. It's the president's decision. Well, no, the king doesn't get to decide the court. The king gets to nominate the court. And the people decide, through their elected officials, the Senate. Where were you when these people were being confirmed? And where will we be next week when we elect people to the House and the Senate? Because hinging on that will be the people who will decide future Supreme Court nominees.
That's right.
Everybody thinks that, well, these people are going to live for 50 years. Not everybody doesn't live for 50 years. Some people do actually die earlier than that. All I'm saying is that we have to bear this burden ourselves to make a commitment to change what we've done in the past for a future. We have to bear the burden.
Yeah.
But you weren't watching. I wasn't watching. I wasn't paying attention. I'm going to pay attention this time. It's going to matter because it matters directly to what happens, what will happen in your life and our children's lives. What are we leaving behind?
And talking about our children, because there are many of us who have influence over teenagers or have younger daughters and so forth. So what is it that we say to them? How do we support them, those that are pregnant or even non-pregnant in this post-ops era that we in? What do we say to them?
Well, we say that we failed. We let this happen, and we're going to do everything we can to restore, to right the wrong. Again, these were not acts of God. These are people doing bad things for women and seeing women in secondary position in society. And the pendulum swings. We have been in places in our society in which things were not so good, and then we fought back. Again, I think we have to keep it in perspective. We fought a civil war over the treatment of human beings, and we are not a perfect nation, but still, we have to still take responsibility for where we are. I think that what is emerging now, I fear, will only dig the hole deeper, and that is to only focus on state-by-state battles, because that means that we are then committing ourselves to fighting this year in and year out and never having it settled. And so what I think we tell our daughters and our granddaughters is that I am going to support any effort that will create a movement that will correct the damage that has been done to our Constitution by this Supreme Court, to assure that the privacy of every American under our Constitution, our private bodies, are not to be the subject of control by the federal government. And so I know that people think that I have 5 heads by saying this, and nobody wants to engage at this level, but in my view, that's the only way that I believe that we can get out of this. Otherwise, there will be turmoil interminably over this, and the losers will not be those of us in this room.
Is there a special role in that for healthcare providers?
Oh, I think that there is absolutely a role. I mean, because this is about healthcare. This is about a healthy society. But it's also a recognition that this is also hard-edged politics, where we really are. It is about politics.
And what about the patients themselves? What can they do to advocate for themselves?
Well,
like if you don't have money and power, what do you?
That's why it's more important for us as their advocate to be effective advocates, and not to say I was surprised that DOPS happened. To say, I'm going to do better, I'm going to be more engaged, and I am going to work with an organization, whatever that organization is, that is committed to turning this around. Because, I mean, the sense of, I'm so surprised, I mean, how could you just be so surprised when there were announcements all along saying that, and perhaps it's, unfortunately,
I didn't believe it was possible.
Why?
It's crazy now to think about that, but I think that then some of the feeling.
When the evidence was so dramatically the opposite.
Just weren't.
But they were in our face. I mean, the right-wing religious denominations enjoined with the Catholic Church elected Ronald Reagan, and this issue has been the driver of the Tea Party, the Contract on America. Did anybody hear about those things? This issue has been it's been the fuel for those movements.
Yeah.
And it still is. And so it just has to be wishful thinking that it wouldn't have effect, because they have promised that even back in the 70s, it was contraception is next, because this is really about religious dogma and controlling behavior, the behavior of women.
Behavior of women. Right. So based on your expert experience, and you've already been telling us things that we can think about and to guide what we do next, but are there actions that people in abortion-supporting states can take now to prevent any negative consequences to support other?
Well, I know to some of you in the audience, I probably sound pretty harsh, but this is a harsh situation. But keep in mind that I'm drawn to this work out of the experience of being a trained nurse, a nurse midwife, and what I saw and thereby would not compromise. Yes, we have to extend compassion and support and care for women during this turbulent passage. But that is not a substitute for changing the passage. If anything, it should amplify our determination to change the passage, to translate into public advocacy what you're seeing in the care that is given through the dedication of a profession. Because that's the legitimate argument. I've often been called dogmatic. Yeah, I'm dogmatic. When you see a woman die from an illegal abortion, that's pretty dogmatic. That's pretty real. And I grew up and was conditioned and raised on judgment, that if you didn't conform to, in my upbringing, my denomination, you were going to hell. Somehow that didn't ever make sense to me, but anyway, that was the way I was raised. But what it did was it was condemnation, and it was rejection of anything other than a proscribed and prescribed lifestyle. And so I just think that it's really important for us not to lose that human, because what you get in all that you are exposed to in your work and in your dedication wherever you are, whether it's in the law or whether it's lawyers talk to people and hear their trials and their tribulations, and not turning away from that. I mean, I've been gone from Planned Parenthood for 30 years almost, and still I'm dedicated to this because I remember when. And also, I was raised on guilt. And so if you didn't do right, then you better, you're going to feel guilty that to deserve what you have to give. And so I don't have a formula for where it should be. I hope that there will emerge a movement that will work toward a constitutional correction, that there will be brains much more brilliant than mine by many times over, that will figure out a language that will protect privacy. Here is Dobbs, but there are other private issues that the court can take a whack at also. And so it really is about the fundamentals of human dignity and the government not invading human dignity. So I don't have a prescription for that. All I can say is, unless we look at the bigger picture and find some engagement, whether it's through your church or through your temple or through your professional organization or through just forming a group of your colleagues that you're going to educate yourself about what's going on, and calling up Schumer and calling up whoever the governor is. Whoever the governor of New York is, You know, what people sometimes may not have known, New York was the first state to reform its abortion laws, and the next year it almost lost. It kept them because the governor would veto the effort, and they did not override the veto. So this is for anybody that thinks that you will find comfort in New York. Just look at the way this election is going, and that there is a great wave here that we should not underestimate the capacity to do damage to all that we have benefited from, and that our children and grandchildren should be benefiting from.
Well, you just gave us our marching orders, because that was my final question, because we want to leave room for others here to ask questions, and it had to do with what action you would say that we should take, alumni, students, and you've already spoken to some of that, but any other point you want to make?
The point I want to make about that also is, I spoke 3 weeks ago at Planned Parenthood, YWCA of Flint, Michigan. And when I started with the need to engage to restore reproductive rights, several women got up and walked out. Yeah. And what I hope to leave with you this evening also is I have never, I think in large part because of my upbringing, have never espoused a doctrine that I am for abortion. It's none of my business. What I am for is that we are allowed the human dignity to make a choice for our lives as a couple.
Come on now, let's give a hand on that.
And that, by the way, goes both ways. A government that can force a woman to extend a pregnancy and force birth can also prevent a woman from doing the same. There are examples of that occurring around the world. The China experience, the Romanian experience with Ceausescu. There are the government intervention, invasion of one's body by order should not be allowed regardless of where one stands. And I'm a true believer in what Roe v. Wade said, although I think it did give a lot of openings for the mischief that women have encountered on these laws and the Supreme Court decisions around regulating the provision and the circumstances. But the concept that this should be really a private matter, protected and shielded from the invasion of politicians, is something that we ought to all stand up and fight for and believe in, because that's what this is about.
Amen. Amen. We want to open up to questions from you all. And is there a mic? Okay, good. Okay. Thank you. Oh. Thank you. I want to go over and hug you, but it's
Oh, I thought there was a question.
I'm wondering if you might comment on, so many people keep saying that this is all about abortion, it's all about abortion, it's all about abortion. As a medical professional, can you just comment on sort of the breadth of what's really impacted by DOMS?
Well, it's not all about abortion. It's about controlling one's body and one's choices, as I've tried to say. And now it's about controlling information. We have a history in this country of making the spread of information about birth control illegal. There was something called the Comstock laws, and that was in the 20th century, by the way. That wasn't in the 17th century. That it was illegal to pass literature through the mails, through the post office. And my organization's founder was jailed 9 times, even though she has been vilified recently. I stand in support of what she did to start this work, get this work underway when she saw her mother experiencing repeat abortions and the poor women of the Lower East Side of New York. And so she started a clinic to help them, and she didn't have much to help them with. She smuggled in diaphragms from Europe. She, charmed men out of their money so that she would have the money to do her work. So it's not unthinkable that the medical abortifacient, I was one of the early, when I was president of Planned Parenthood, actually beseeched the firm that invented RU46 to permit Planned Parenthood to bring it to the United States. They would not do so. This would have been in the mid-'80s. We tried to get RU486 into our hands so that we could distribute it. So I hear with concern the comfort idea that is no comfort at all, that medical abortifacients can be a substitute for surgical procedures, and ideal for a woman who doesn't want to have doesn't want to continue a pregnancy. The sooner you do that, the safer the procedure. It's in her best interest and her life to do so as quickly as possible. But the fantasy that this will solve the problem and that the government can't intervene in that way is just, again, ignoring history and ignoring the composition of the House and the Senate likely to be next week, and all of the mischief that can be imposed by those federal laws. There was a time when we beat these laws down. In the early 80s, the Human Life Amendment could not be passed because we fought them and defeated them. One of the reasons that we have the state-by-state strategy is because they gave up in Congress and said, we're going to go to the states, we're going to take this to the states. Unfortunately, and I think this gets back to something you said earlier that I didn't include, unfortunately, I think that we did not elevate the dangers that were going on in the states to a national threat.
Right.
5 years ago, because my family is, as I said earlier, that you guys heard a while ago, overstayed our time, from Mississippi, and so my cousin still works for the Children's Defense Fund there. She runs the regional office there. My family has always been involved in civic engagements. My uncles provided safe houses for the kids who came down in the early 60s to do voter registration, so that has always been the case. And so, how did I get off on that? Sorry. Anyway, I'll come back to it. I got it on another. What did you add? Oh, I paid attention. I got it. So I said to Cecile at one of our breakfast get-togethers, I don't understand. I mean, the irony was 5 years ago, I didn't realize that Dobbs was going to end up in the Supreme Court. I said to her, what's going on in Mississippi and why are we telling the world, and this is where I think the institutions fail, why aren't we telling the world what's going on in Mississippi, that every woman in this country is threatened by what's going on in Mississippi? That it should not be the vagaries of our residents, our street number and our zip code, that we are protected. And that every state that passed these laws should have been held up for condemnation at the time. And then maybe you wouldn't have said, I was so surprised.
Right.
Because maybe it would have not, the outcome might have been different. And so I hope that the strategy, and this is why I think that a constitutional amendment is desirable, because I think it would give focus also. You know, the dissipation of state by state, well, we're in New York. By the way, I was running Planned Parenthood of Dayton when the New York, well, no, not quite. New York was reformed before I was running it, but when it really got underway, and it was that and California were basically the only games in town. This place was a hellhole. Every woman who could get herself here to terminate a pregnancy came to New York, very often at the mercy of unscrupulous providers that claimed, I can do your abortion for $800 or $500 or whatever. It got to be so bad that we had to go through a referral agency to guarantee, in a reformed state, to guarantee a safe pregnancy termination in New York City.
Wow.
And when they came back to Ohio, we hoped that they would not have complications because the doctors there, under threat that they would be associated with a pregnancy termination, didn't want to have anything to do with the women. And so we had to try to make do. I mean, these are the realistic problems of patchwork rights.
Yeah.
You know, there's a reason why we have broad fundamental protections, because we are supposed to be united in a vision of what our privacy should be in this country and what the opportunities should be for those of us who are citizens, whether native born or immigrated. So again, I was running a Planned Parenthood affiliate at that point, and so you're not going to tell me what this is, how insignificant any of this is, or why I should compromise. Or the one thing that I love is, let's find common ground. Well, what ground would that be? Tell me what am I supposed to give up to satisfy you, who has no reason to be in my business? And this is common ground, that you have the common right to pursue your life as you see fit in a safe fashion, hopefully with those who love you and support you, and let us get on with creating a society that is more equitable and caring, and that makes sure that you don't arrive at a point that you are pregnant and don't want to be. So, I mean, that goes all the way back to, we are sexual creatures. We should recognize that in our schools. That's a hotbed where a lot of battles around where it comes at adulthood and sexual maturity get started. We can't stop sexual development. The only question is, we can distort it and we can shame it and we can make it tough for people to deal with, whatever their sexual spectrum may be, as opposed to saying this is a part of being human. And so we have to treat it as such and treat it appropriately and create an environment that is accepting as human beings, as a fundamental right.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you very much. As an undergraduate who's pursuing clinical research, do you think there is a role, and if so, can you speak to it?
Sorry, do I think?
That there's a potential for clinical research to kind of play a part in swinging the pendulum back the other way in the next few years. Could you speak to it? Thank you.
I think through the mask, I heard, do I think that there's a role for clinical research to play a part? Yes, I think there's a role for everyone to play a part, and that's the point I was trying to make. Find your lane, but play a part. But data is really important. I'm glad you asked that question, because I would have been nothing as a leader had it not been for the research that was being done by who was then our special affiliate at the Alan Goodwalker Institute. That did a lot of the tracking data, a lot of the data that were the underpinnings of the lawsuits that we brought against the Reagan administration and the Herbert Walker Bush administration and the gag orders, and the damage that it does. That isn't to say that people will be compelled by data, but certainly it gives a certain power to our voice, and so understand that when you are collecting knowledge, that knowledge conveyance to people who may be on the front line and in other roles is a very powerful tool, very important. To give you an example, right after Reagan was elected, it was a convergence of the right-wing religious denominations in the Catholic Church, and along with other very reactive groups. I don't call them conservative because I like to think I'm pretty conservative, but they came together and they decided that they were going to defund the left. That was their thing. We were going to defund the left. And the first organization that Reagan announced he would defund was Planned Parenthood. We were ground zero. And so how do we do that? We had the Title X program that had come out of the Great Society, the War on Poverty, and Title X was an ambitious program that was designed to close the gap between low-income women and affluent women, read that, women of color and white women, with family planning services. It could not be used for abortion services. However, it was a program that provided services to teens without parental consent. So the first attack, and this I take great exception to the governor saying that abortion is safe here. And if there's any perhaps new piece of information that I would leave you with, and it is government regulations can have the same force as law. And so, yes, it can be legal here, but if you elect a governor that puts in place people who pass regulations that have the effect of thwarting the exercise of that law, they have still achieved their aims. And so we went to court. You know, I was young in I was 33 when I became president of Planned Parenthood. That was really crazy. As I look back on it, it was pretty crazy that the organization selected me. But I was impatient, and we're going to sue Reagan because it was an outrage. I had run a Planned Parenthood affiliate that provided services to kids, and so I had that empirical experience and knowledge. And battling with board members who said, you better not serve my daughter in this clinic, or I'm going to do everything I can to get off this board and shut your funding down. And we would say, okay, but we're going to serve your daughters if she comes to our clinic. And if we have any principles, and this gets back to my mother and principles, but her principles were the Bible. And that's a whole other conversation. If we have any principles, we hold that we will provide confidential services to everyone. We will not reveal information about our patients. So along comes the squeal rule as one of the first initiatives of the Reagan administration. And it required that clinics that received Title X funding could not provide services, prescription services, to teenagers, to minors, without reporting to parents 10 days after distribution. Well, since the only gender that can receive prescription birth control are girls, this was going to be tattling to parents about their daughters being in our birth control clinics. We weren't having that. And so we went to court. And the data that we were able to show from the Guttmacher Institute that had done a number of studies that showed the number of kids that would not come to our clinics if they knew that we were going to tattle, they were going to tell their parents. The number of kids that would still come, as I remember, it was about 50%. And as I remember, there was 25% that said that they would still come if, there were 25% that said that they would still come, and then there were 25% said that they would come if their parents were told. And that kind of formed the backbone of our lawsuit. Without that data, without showing that the real effect is going to be more kids pregnant. And here is another thing. Do we stay here all night talking about this?
What is our timing?
I'll leave with you this, because I see this creeping into the debate around parents having the right to make a decision. And I always find that quite curious, that I didn't want the right to decide whether Felicia is pregnant or have a child. But why would I have that right and not have the right to say, well, I approve her pregnancy? Isn't pregnancy, shouldn't I have to be the one, if I have to be the one that approves a termination, shouldn't I have to be the one to say, I approve pregnancy? I mean, isn't that a much more significant event in everybody's life, including the young people involved? So whatever you leave here with, I hope, it's that these are complex issues,
Yes.
especially unsuited for politicians
Particularly.
or your meddling neighbors. I'm seeing most of you tonight. I have a soror that I've known for decades. I met a soror, is she still here tonight? Oh, behind her. And who wouldn't it be unconscionable for me to walk up to you and say, well, I'm going to pass a law that makes sure you do this with your body and with your life and with the choices that you make in your life. I don't think that's where we want to be, any place on this planet, let alone in this country.
Thank you so much. This has been.
Wow! Is she great or what? How lucky we are to be here. I'm Lori Magid, Columbia Law School, 1985, a member of the Columbia Alumni Association Board, a university senator, but most important tonight, I was privileged to be on the planning committee with the alumni leadership group to plan this incredible event. Faye and Vivian, thank you so much for the inspiring, thought-provoking, but most of all, incredibly frank discussion of these difficult issues, and for sharing really so much of yourself personally with us. It's very important to hear that. Everyone, one more round of applause for Faye and Vivian. Before we close, I have little gifts, goodie bags, as my 19-month-old granddaughter, who I work at every conversation, says, goodie bags for Halloween.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for coming tonight.
Just a few more things, because it takes a village to put this together. So I also want to acknowledge the other members of the planning committee, Brenda Aiken, who you've met, Tanya Spence, Tana, wave to the crowd, Jane Marchant, who's off in California, our fearless leaders, Anna Rodriguez and Francine Glick, here in the front. Also, thanks to the School of Nursing's Alumni and Development Office, Sharon Sobel and Janet Rafferty-Grady, who have been great, and to Riley Jones and the entire executive board of the Black Alumni Council, and to the CAA's own fabulous staff, especially Jenna Farley and Nick Menino. We could not have done this without you. And most of all, thanks to all of you for being here live and in person. I was fortunate enough to be on the prep session with Faye, so that was by Zoom in a little tiny box. And I thought, she's so inspiring. Even in a little box, live and in person is really the way you want to go for a She Opened the Door event. So please enjoy the refreshments, the opportunity to socialize, to share, how you're feeling about Faye's and Vivian's very frank comments on these critical issues. And thank you. I hope to see you at our next She Opened the Door event in person. Thank you.